today's fireside chat session is really focused on the topic of SME ecosystems, which is what we help, which is one of the fundamental drivers of the growth in India globally and also drivers of employment. So we have a couple of questions, and I would like to sort of begin by asking you specifically on the SME ecosystems in India. Firstly, what's your take on the current state of the SME ecosystem health in India? I mean, there are different reports that talk about the different aspects of SME ecosystem. We also know that we have set a very ambitious target of $5 trillion coming from India, and a substantial portion of that hopefully should come from the SME ecosystem. But we also know, on the other hand, given my experience of last 3 decades and having worked with hundreds and hundreds of organizations, and from your collective experience as well, that we scale of several thousands and millions of the very small SMEs who are not necessarily doing well, right? So on one hand, we have the tall aspirations and ambition. On the other hand, we have a trail. What is your take on the SME ecosystem health in India today? And what do you think are the top 3 things that we should do to address them?
Very important question, Nitik. I mean, unfortunately, what is happening in India is I think the SME sector by itself is very huge. And I think a very significant portion, I think about 35% of our GDP contribution comes from the SME sector. However, if you look at the vast majority of the SMEs, they are well below the 5 crore revenue number. There's certain who are above 5 to 25, and then there are very few who are bigger. Unfortunately, there isn't a very clear focus on many of these SMEs, either by the government or the private sector. So that's, I think, one of the biggest challenges that we face. And I think especially over the last 2 years, if you realized, while there were few sectors like EdTech, Pharma, and others that grew exponentially, given the COVID demands. But the larger portion of the SMEs were hugely affected by the COVID. Many of them had to, shut down shop or at least be temporarily closed before they could reconvene. Mm-hmm. Another big thing which is happening is I think the access to the credit has been fairly limited. I think that's one of the biggest challenge that we keep observing about SMEs. And I think that's one major issue that we all need to look at very closely. And lastly, I think the global macroeconomics factors aren't really working very well. I mean, there's a huge impact of the global phenomena on India as well. While India by itself is doing very well, but the global factors are certainly affecting how business performs in India. So these are the few factors which I believe are to be considered. Coming to your second question, Samir, I think you talked about what are the few things that need to be addressed to improve the SME health. I probably would put it slightly differently. So first and foremost, if I take the clue from the earlier point I talked about on the access to capital. While the government and the private sector has been trying to do a lot of different things, but a lot of it remains on paper. The credit, the access to credit, the access to working capital, money is still not as easy for most of the SMEs. And I think that continues to remain a challenge. For example, I mean, something slightly vague, if you can think of. What if we introduce some kind of a credit agency which actually rates these SMEs? And I'm not talking about the large corporates, I'm talking about SMEs, which does a rating based on their revenue, their stability, their GST and TDS payments, and so on. And so these are stable SMEs, or these are SMEs which are eligible for working capital loan at a much lesser rate, and these things can be processed collectively. If we could have something of the sort, I think the access to capital and the cost of capital both will be better for SMEs. So that's just a thought, which I think we all need to look at from cost of capital. Another point I just want to highlight here is, if you look at the GST and the TDS, right? In my experience, working capital has been one of the biggest issues, and GST and TDS are one big contribution to that problem. If you look at the typical invoice cycle for any SME, you do the business for one, or at the end of the month, you will raise an invoice. The moment you raise an invoice, within a few days, your GST is due, right? Your TDS would also be due. Sure. Wherein the invoice payments do not necessarily happen within the 45 days or 60 days, which is stipulated by the government, right? Government actually insists that SME payments must happen within 45 days. Many times these payments get dragged for 60 days, 90 days. And I'm also an angel investor, and I know many of the startups which I've invested in, they struggle to get the payments in a timely fashion from some of the very reputed firms. Now, with that, what happens is you're not only investing in the inventory management, in your cash flow management, and so on, you're also paying to the government from your pocket, right? For the period where the client has not paid you, but you have already paid the GST and other taxes. Now, that gap is huge. Any entity which is doing, let's say, a 10 crore business and is paying 18% service tax has to keep 1.8 crore. I'm talking about the monthly, 10 crore business. So it has to keep that 1.8 crore per month aside for the GST payment. And that's a huge portion of the working capital that is taken from this fee. We're actually talking about 18% of the growth capital they could have otherwise utilized for some of their other needs. So these are some of the critical challenges when it comes to access to capital, which I believe must be addressed in the right way. The couple of other things which I believe, and I'll probably even seek your views on it. I think two other areas which I believe have to be addressed. One is the access to market, for SME. And in my experience, I think many of the SMEs come to us asking for, how do we improve our marketing? How do we improve our sales? Because end of the day, revenue generation is what they all are looking at. If they have revenue generation, they will have enough capital or cash to push back into the business to generate employment. So that access to that additional, market where they can sell their products or services is something that's a challenge. Interestingly, Government of India has actually come up with things like ONDC, Open Network for Digital E-commerce. These are likely to benefit some of the SMEs over the period of time. Very interesting initiatives. I think we just have to see how SMEs adopt to these, how the larger competitors play on these initiatives. Are they pushing back, or are they actually, joining hands? So these are two things. I'll pause for a moment, and then I think we could also talk about the technology, which is a third factor that plays a big role. Just want to, hear your views. Do you think this is the right approach, or is there anything else?
I think that's these are very valuable thoughts, and just to sort of share what I feel about some of the points that you mentioned: access to capital, access to markets, and participation in some of the government new initiatives such as ONDC are extremely helpful. So from my perspective, we have a dichotomic situation. We have about $600 billion of deficit in financing as far as the SMEs are concerned. So that's our internal calculation suggests. But on the other hand, there is no paucity of capital. It's about basically instilling the confidence in the lenders and investors that the money will be paid back. So I believe fundamentally there is an issue about the robustness of the business plan and ability to sort of scale up, which makes the lenders and the investors nervous, and which is why you will find lots of applicants but very few takers, because at the end of the day money doesn't exchange hands. So there is money available but unutilized and not leveraged. So I think we need to focus on the sort of improvement of the robustness of their scalable plans and revenue generation ability, which is your next point, which is access to markets and revenue sort of plans that need to be really bolstered. And at Wadhwani Foundation, as you know, we are very focused on the growth element of the MSMEs because that's ultimately for us, growth is survival. It's not that you survive and then you grow. It's basically growth is survival. And I think you are absolutely right on those 2 points. I completely concur with that. The other issue that we feel, I don't know what's your experience, Sunil, is that often there is the gap in implementation. 73% of the transformations really fail. And in SME's case, basically 90% of the transformations really don't succeed, right? And that's a staggeringly high number. And I think that has to do with the deficit of skills in program management office in terms of how to implement things, etc. That also need to be imparted very effectively in addition to solving the problem of the SMEs. So I believe some of these are very, very important topics. And at the end of the day, when it comes to working capital cycles, so when it comes to revenue enhancement, when it comes to markets, etc., there also has to be an integrated approach between the ecosystem players.